Now we're going to do an exercise which involves dialogue, and you're going to do this in pairs. And to do this, I need one of each pair to leave the room for a moment while I explain the rules to the others. So we'll start with the trainees. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Would all the twos leave the room for just a minute or so while I explain the rules? Let's go through the rules. So we're going to do a dialogue exercise here for 3 minutes. And this is what it might be a slightly different kind of conversation than you're normal to, that you're used to having. Right. So here's what I want you to say to your partner when they come back in the room and I start the exercise. Tell me about the beginnings of your interest in geoscience. And then let them talk for 3 minutes, all right? Your goal is to say nothing else for 3 minutes, okay? But try to avoid any prolonged silence, okay? So how are you going to do this? Ideally, you say nothing and they just keep talking, okay? But if they stop talking and there's a bit of a silence, you could nod, you could use your body language to show your interest. Or surprise, trying to encourage them to get talking with body language, right? If that doesn't work, then you can use some verbal cues that don't actually ask them anything further. So, for example, you could say, oh, okay, oh, I see, wow, interesting, okay, this kind of thing. But you're not asking anything. And each time you, did I have this up here? Yeah, really is fine. Right. And each time you use one of those words, I would like you to try and recognise that you're doing it and put a mark in the box that says verbal cues, just so that you identify that you're doing it. This is not marking you. This is just so that you can see what you're doing. All right. If you're not getting far enough with that, then you can use open-ended questions or prompts. So what that means, an open-ended question is something that gives your partner the opportunity to answer in whatever way they want. There's no restriction. It's not a yes-no question. So it could be, oh, how did that make you feel? What happened next? Go on. Can you tell me more about that? What did you think about that? And each time you notice yourself doing that, put a mark in the open-ended question box. Now, this is what you should try not to do. Try not to ask any closed-ended questions. That means questions with a yes or no answer, or questions where they have a very limited range of replies, like, for example, oh, where did you go to university? Who was your lecturer? Were you interested in that? Yes, no. That kind of thing. These are all closed questions. And finally, definitely don't make any of your own input into the conversation, right? Don't give your own opinions. Don't say, oh, something like that happened to me as well, and then start talking about yourself. Don't do that. It's not about you, it's about them, okay? But if you do that, try and note down that you've done it so that you recognise it. Okay, finally, of course, your partner doesn't know the rules. Okay, they'll find out afterwards. And then at the end of the exercise, I'm going to get both of you to reflect on how it went, all right, what it felt like. Okay, so we'll go back to this. And once they come in, you've got 3 minutes. All right, Krishna, could you bring them in again? Okay, welcome back, everyone. So as I said, you're doing this dialogue in pairs. And it's going to be a 3-minute exercise, and I would like the number ones to start now.
Yeah. Can you tell me about the beginning of interest in geoscience?
Wow, that has actually been quite recently that I got interested in geoscience. Only I think 1.5 years ago. So yeah, because before I worked on energy and climate. So the topic is really new to me, and I think that attracts me. So it's something I don't know about, and I'm always curious about new things. So and I think that I got in contact on this topic, and I thought, hey, this is really interesting. I don't know much about the subsurface at all, yeah, that's how I got interested in that.
And how's that working for you?
So far, it's good. It's also challenging for me because I'm not a geologist by background, so I lack sometimes a little bit of the knowledge and expertise. But it worked quite well with me because more and more topics that I've been working on in the past, so energy transition, climate change, there is now the link with geoscience aspects. So that makes it actually quite interesting that I can make that bridge between energy transition and climate and these kinds of things. So in that sense, it works.
So was it exciting at first?
It was challenging indeed. Yeah, especially because you need a lot of people that can share. So just as we said that some simple assumption is that you don't know anything, but there are also quite often the assumption is, as I'm saying, I'm from Geological the Netherlands, that people start rambling about all these geoscientific things that I don't know. So that is, or even that's also within geoscientific, we have a totally different subsurface as other countries, and we don't have mining things. So we only have sand, gravel, and these kinds of things in the Netherlands. So even there, you see that there is even within European, there's a misunderstanding that people are talking about things that we are not doing and what we are doing in the Netherlands.
Okay, you can start wrapping up now, everyone. And what I'd like you all to do now is look at the questions on the piece of paper you have. So I think this one is for you, and this one is for you on the other side. And just take a couple of minutes to answer the questions on the piece of paper you have. So you just write down a couple of thoughts. You know, you don't have to write detailed answers. Could be just one word, your reflection on the experience. And so for those of you who are outside the room, these were the rules. In an ideal situation, the person who asked you the question at the beginning didn't say anything else for the whole 3 minutes, and it was just you that was talking. But if they needed to try and keep the communication going, they were instructed to try and do that by just making verbal cues without asking any questions. Oh, go on. Interesting. Huh, right. Or if they really needed to push it, ask open-ended questions like, oh, how did you feel about that? What happened next? This kind of thing. Trying to avoid any closed questions like, what year did you study? Did you enjoy your studies? This kind of thing. And to avoid completely giving any of their own opinions or input to the conversation. Okay, does anyone have any comments about how they found that exercise? Was it easy? Was there anything unusual, surprising, difficult? Anyone like to share their thoughts?
I found it educative, but I noticed that you can know so much, but you will not be open to say it all if the other party is not communicating back.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
It felt like I was writing an exam.
Okay.
I had to be specific about things. I kept on asking feedback questions on the already asked question.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But she was able to pick up my body language.
Good.
She always said, Do you still need me to say more?
Okay, yeah.
I felt like I was giving an interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they speak and I just ask the questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it was a bit uncomfortable for you to ask. Yeah. Yeah.
I often have such experiences, but then the fact that I couldn't really comment on what he was saying, that oh snap, I know about that, and I remember reading about this and that, and I just couldn't feedback.
Right.
But then, yeah, it was flowing. It was a flowing conversation and quite informative.
And did it go in the direction you expected it to?
Pretty much so.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I just couldn't comment.
Yep. Okay. Good. All right, thanks. If you're willing to, and you don't have to put your names on the papers, but it would be great if we could collect what you've written down as well as feedback. So just to give you a little bit of feeling about dialogue, where you're leaving it to your audience to have the communication without putting anything much in yourself. Okay. Right, I'd like to move on to this last model of communication. One second. Okay, this third and last model I'm going to show you is a bit more complicated. In this case, the communicating parties and people are sending messages continuously and simultaneously, and the communication is also responsive to the total environment that the communication is happening within. So that might sound a bit messy and complicated. So here we don't have a transmitter and receiver. Everyone's involved in communicating, and we're trying to be conscious of the whole environment that the communication is happening in and the relationships between all the communicators involved as the communication happens. Another way that this kind of communication has been described is in terms of understanding science communication through the frame of culture. So if you look at this diagram, we're taking into consideration the full range of experience and background of everyone involved, right? So you can perhaps see the link with culture here. And while culture is a pretty difficult term to define, it's related to our whole background and identity as people and communities. So in this cultural context, we're no longer simply talking about encoding and decoding and interpreting a message and then sending the message back again in the same way. We're talking about a total experience, and we're encapsulating other aspects that we haven't considered yet, such as emotion into the picture, which we'll talk about more. And what should result from this kind of model of communication is a much more engaged experience where shared meaning is created by engagement of everyone involved. So, okay. Krishnan, could you come and sit down here for a minute? Sorry, I haven't briefed Krishnan on this at all. I was going to do with this with Celine, but she's too far away. All right, so here's an example. Let's say I come over here and I start talking to Krishnan like this, and he leans away a bit because he's feeling a bit uncomfortable and he's feeling a bit tense about me talking to him from this distance. And then I realise that there's some tension here, and so I stand back a bit and give him a bit more space, and I can see that he starts to relax, and then I start to lose my train of thought, and Krishnan gets up and opens a window because he realises it's quite hot in here and that's probably distracting me, and then I realise that that's why he's done it, and oh, that's really nice. And so I smile and he smiles at me. So there's this whole communication happening that's related to the whole environment we're in, our own personal space. All of these things are contributing to how we're communicating with each other, okay? So this is kind of some of the ideas around this model, which is called the transactional model of communication. Right. Okay. Now, you have no doubt been subjected to a whole lot of COVID-related restrictions over the last few years and had a lot more online meetings. How do they compare with in-person meetings? Sorry?
Not much time, not that much interaction.
Not much interaction, yeah. Yeah. Exhausting.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. Can you think of how to relate that experience with, in contrast, with this model? What's the difference? What do you get in this model of communication that you don't get through online meetings? You don't get this personal, so much of this personal connection. Yeah.
Communication sometimes is not just verbal, but as you've explained, it's expressions of faces and physical,
Yeah,
so you
exactly.
totally lose out on that.
Exactly. You miss a lot of that body language. Sometimes you don't even see the person, so you get none of that. You also have, often you don't even know where that person is. They could be at home or at work or in their car. You don't know what's going on in the background. You know, there might be other stuff happening in the background that is impacting them. Yeah, all these things. So all of that general context of the environment that people are in is important, really important for communication, and that's a fundamental reason why online communication has a lot of challenges. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how people learn. And what I want to talk about is this idea of constructivism. Has anyone heard of this before? The constructivism says that learners construct knowledge based on what they already know. Okay, rather than just passively taking in some information and going, oh, okay, now I understand this. They're building it onto their existing models of how things work, all right? Their existing understanding. And what this means is that learners are creating these mental models all the time of how things work based on both what they know and the information that they're receiving, how that fits with their experience and knowledge. And so when you think about it that way, you can see that every person is going to have a different understanding of information because every person has different knowledge, different experiences, and they're building onto that, okay? And these mental models that they create are not always correct, and in fact, they never are. And I'll talk more about this. But first, given that people learn in this way, they construct based on what they already know, what does that suggest to you about where you should start when you're trying to communicate something?
Start from the basics.
Yes. Yeah, how do you know what the basics are? Let's say you're telling me about some data that you've got. All right. So how are you going to know where to start with me?
Wow.
Yeah.
I think I need to understand you as my audience.
Yes, know your audience. How do you know what I know? Sorry? Ask me. Yes, right. Okay. You need to find out what your audience already knows about what you want to communicate. That's your starting point. It's not necessarily easy, but that is the best way. Okay. Right. So you can't assume what people know, and we will come back to that. So once you know where to start, you move step by step. If you think about, for example, learning a musical instrument, all right, somebody's starting to learn the piano, you don't sit them down and say, okay, we're going to learn how to play this Mozart sonata. You start with one hand and then the other, and then you go slowly and you practice step by step, all right? That's how we learn. Small steps, lots of practice. So a little bit more about mental models. What does that mean? Okay. Mental models, they're the internal picture in our mind that we have of how things actually work in reality. And when I say reality, It implies that there is an objective reality, which in fact scientific studies say that there isn't. And you can read more about that if you're interested. But if we think again about the fact that everybody has a different experience, you know, all of the experiences in their lives add up to their perception of the world, then everybody has a slightly different perception of what reality is. Most of us think that our perception is reality. It's not. It's our interpretation. Okay. Right. So, constructivism tells us that we've been all busily building our own understanding of the world based on all of the different experiences we've had and the information that we get. So we think this is reality. It's just our view. And this diagram here tries to show this. So what it says is that let's say that there actually is some kind of reality that's objective out there, all right? Then what happens is we come along and try and understand how it works, but there are bits out here, let's see, that we don't realise exist, okay, we haven't considered. So there are factors we haven't considered, and then there are things that we have considered that actually don't exist, they're not correct, all right? So our picture, our mental model, is built up of some things that probably match reality, some things that are just wrong, and some things that we haven't considered at all right? And then we come up with this model here, right? And on that basis, we decide what questions, answers, opportunities there are, and then we take some action as a result of this model, which is, at least in some part, wrong, okay? But when you're communicating, you need to have a reasonable idea of what mental model your audience has. And I think I've already heard some examples of mental models that are not what your picture of reality is, okay, in regard to flying geophysical surveys, for example. And I have another similar example. So my husband is also a geologist. He's a mineral exploration geologist, and many years ago, he was the senior geologist on a diamond exploration project in Canada. And before the field season, the company he was working for had organised a community meeting. So he, as the lead geologist, was supposed to stand up in front of the community and explain the exploration work that they wanted to do and make sure the community was informed and help to develop the relationship with the community. So he went to the meeting, and there were 30 or 40 people there. And he explained that they were interested in a magnetic anomaly that sat underneath the local lake on the edge of town. And what they wanted to do was wait until the winter when the ice had frozen on the top of the lake. Then they would drive out a drill rig, drill through the lake in the centre, drill through the bottom, bring up a drill core, see if they had kimberlite, the rock that has can have diamonds in it, and test it for diamond indicator minerals. And after he gave the presentation, a man in the audience stood up and said, "If you drill a hole in the bottom of our lake, surely all the water's going to drain out the bottom." And nobody laughed. So this mental model was not so far different from the other people in the room, but it hadn't remotely occurred to my husband that people would think that the water would drain out. So this is something that we'll come back to again and again, but it demonstrates that we have to know our audience in order to figure out what we should be talking about, okay? What mental model have they created, and how closely does that match what we think is reality, right? All right, let's move on to learning styles. And what I mean by this is how people like to learn or find easiest to learn. Can anyone think of an example of an environment where they found that the learning that they got was really rich, that they really got something out of it? And in that situation, what were you doing? Were you reading a book, or anyone think of any examples? Yep.
Taking part in practical exercise.
Right.
Okay. Practical exercises. Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Nobody's talking much. That's okay. But the point of this is actually to tell you that people learn in all sorts of different ways. And that's both good news and bad news, because it means that there are all sorts of different ways that you can connect with people, but it also means that there are all sorts of different ways you should connect with people, so that you make the learning opportunity accessible for as many people as possible. Now, this is just one model, and there are other models for how people learn. It's called the VARC model. So V in this case stands for visual learners who like to see things and put them into a spatial context. For example, maps. So structural geologists often tend to be people who learn in a visual way. They can see things in 3 dimensions, like diagrams and patterns. Auditory learners like to hear or to speak. So things like group discussions, radio, making presentations, listening to podcasts might appeal to these kind of learners. Read and write learners obviously like to read and write. They like information as words. So books, essays, looking for information on the internet. And K is for kinesthetic. Kinesthetic learners have a preference for experience and practical activities. They like to get involved. So things like demonstrations, simulations, case studies. They like examples. But then there are lots of people who, people don't fall into just one category. They're often a combination of these. So they might prefer one style in one situation, another style in another, and so on. So there's a lot of complexity there. And this is just a more in-depth look at the different kinds of learning. So active learners want to be involved. They want to experience things. They want to solve problems. Reflective learners like to watch and critically evaluate things before they get involved. Theorists like to understand the theory first before they actually apply it, whereas pragmatists, they're the other way around. They want to practice it to see how it works, okay? Interpersonal communicators like to interact. They need to talk about things and, communicate to help them to understand and learn, whereas intrapersonal people like to think about things themselves. They're self-motivated. They like to work alone. That's how they like to learn. So this just addresses how people like to approach learning, but there's a great deal to learning which you could consider when you're trying to communicate science. And in that regard, you might like to consider, it's a bit hard to see here, but you will have access to this as well, that at one end of this spectrum, if you just want people to remember something, that's not necessarily that difficult to get something across and get them to remember it. But if you really want your audience to engage and take on board and use what you're telling them and act or change their behaviours, create things with the knowledge, then that involves a lot of higher level thinking and a lot of investment of thought and action and time to get that to that point. So consider that when you're considering the goals of your science communication. If you expect a lot from your audience in what you expect them to do with it, then you are going to have to invest a lot of time and effort in engaging with them to get to that point.